Okay, well, first, before I start, I'd like to take the opportunity to thank all the organizers. Doing this sort of thing takes a ton of work, and so thanks to everyone. Okay, now, in my talk, you'll probably notice I have not counting the bibliography, I have over 62 slides. I assure you that I'm skipping some. But let's begin. Okay, I've got two interacting objectives here, two things I want to do. First, I want to reconstruct certain features of Frege's environment that people have, have neglected, right, and sort of regarded as not super interesting. But I'm going to dig into it because I think it does have some significance. And one of the things that's really quite striking, as I'll say, is that Frege in Jena at the time, to the extent that he hung out with philosophers, he was hanging out with people who were followers of Schelling. They were romantics. They had affinities with Goethe. And there's this question, how might that have colored his sense of philosophy? Or at least, and I think this is also an issue, this is typically what I'm going to concentrate on, how did they give him a way of talking? Right, what kind of references did he feel he could presuppose when he was talking to philosophers? Right, okay, so I'm going to reconstruct that context and in particular sort of indicate how Schelling comes in. And the narrow objective, just to indicate that this has significance for Frege interpretation, I want to clarify an obscure but really centrally important section, section 88, of Frege's 1884 classic Grundlagen der Arithmetik, which I will call Grundlagen from now on. Okay, so first here's the passage, and you'll see why it's a bit of a head scratcher, right? It's a little bit longer than this, but I'm just quoting the parts that are directly relevant, right? So he has been talking about Kant and Kant's suggestion that arithmetic can't, or that logic can't extend knowledge, and so arithmetic can't be logic. And he says, critically, Frege says, Kant seems to think of concepts as defined by giving a simple list of characteristics in no particular order. Through the definitions given in the course of this book, we will scarcely find one that's of this description. The same is true of the truly fruitful definitions of mathematics, such as the continuity of a function. We do not have here a series of conjunctions of characteristics, but rather a more intimate, I would say more organic connection of defining elements. Right. So, the first part of the first three sentences, you say, okay, I can kind of get what he's saying there, right? Kant is sort of stringing together a bunch of properties, and that's not a particularly useful way of defining things. I'm doing something different. And then he hits it with this biological metaphor. Right, okay. So, then in the continuation, Frege continues to claim that his system can represent the truly fruitful concepts. He cites explicitly mathematical continuity and implicitly the concept of number. And then he gives this incredibly obscure, compressed, and metaphorical explanation of why his concepts and not Kant's can do this. Right, so it continues. With the list of characteristics definitions, nothing essentially new emerges in the process. But the more fruitful type of concept determination draws boundary lines that were not previously given at all. What we shall be able to infer from it cannot be inspected in advance. Here we are not simply taking out of the box again what we have just put into it. These consequences extend our knowledge and are therefore on Kant's view to be regarded as synthetic, yet they can be proven purely logically or nor thus analytic. They are, in fact, contained in the definitions, but like a plant in a seed, not like the beams in a house. You say, well, that's pretty helpful. I understand it now. Plant and seed, beams and house, all clear, right? Now, this is actually a crucial, now, first of all, and Frege uses this language a lot in his early writings. It kind of vanishes later. There's a story about that, but I won't tell it here. They're actually very common, and so is his use of these sort of metaphor of things growing from a seed. or other words like kernel, germ. I'm just choosing different words to mark the different German words, but they all mean basically seed, and the same idea of things growing for a seed. Now, the thing is, this is very compressed. It's hard to understand, but it's absolutely crucial for his overall project because a fundamental objection, maybe the most salient objection to his entire project of trying to prove that mathematical arithmetic is logic, is Kant's position that logic cannot extend knowledge, and that arithmetic does extend knowledge, so arithmetic can't be logic. And this is the only place where Frege answers Kant. Right? The only place in his writings. And so you think, okay, well, he probably must hope that people get what he is saying. Right? This is key. It's going to be a key. And so, but somehow you think, boy, it's pretty foggy for something that important. Okay, so some years ago, I addressed this passage, and I gave an account, which I think, as far as it goes, I still think is entirely correct, up to a little bit of fine-tuning. And then I said, well, and what I did in that was I looked to an unpublished paper that he wrote, which is translated in different ways, but I'll translate it as Boole's Calculating Logic and the Concept Script. And in that is an extended, detailed argument that Frege's logic is superior to that of Boole and people in the Boolean tradition like Schroeder. Right? Now also, and that turned out to be, as I'll refer to it again, a Rosetta Stone, right? With that in hand, you can see exactly, well, a lot of what he's saying in section 88, right? Because first of all, Frege had a working mathematician's sense of the kinds of concepts that are fruitful. He mentions, mentions continuity, for example. Right? And this was also something he took to be important. He took the fruitfulness of concepts to be a sign, the behavior of concepts in scientific practice, right? The delivering results in science, that was a sign of their fruitfulness, right? He says, this is from the Boole's Calculating Logic paper. He says, all these concepts have been developed in science and have proved their fruitfulness. For this reason, what we may find in them has a higher claim on our thought than what our everyday trains of thought might offer. Fruitfulness is the acid test of concepts in scientific workshops, logic's true field of observation. All right, so that's the first foothold. Now also, and this is now going through what I was saying in 1995, Frege combined his emphasis on fruitfulness with a very compelling picture of how the inner structure of some salient examples of fruitful concepts in mathematics can be represented in his logic and not in the Boole-Schroeder alternative, right? And he gives an informal characterization of why his account can do this. His system allows the formation of new concepts by beginning with a given statement, breaking it down into components, right, where it's also a principle he's using that you begin with content and break it down, and then you recompose the contents in various ways to get a new content, right? So that's how you're getting something new here. Now, he also shows, goes through in detail through a bunch of mathematical principles and shows how you can represent them in his system, and it's sort of there are certain key results which then become almost a matter of simple technique, like 6 or 7 line proof. Once you've made this representation, not only continuity, but uniform and point-wise convergence of series, for example, a bunch of different concepts in mathematical analysis, right? And the basic point is always that because his system decomposes contents into a function argument, and other decompositions can give you other functions and other arguments, and you can recombine them in new ways, that allows for genuine novelty, right? And Frege can represent this in a way that the Boole and Schroeder can't. Okay, so, and I still think that's right, but the problem is that but as will happen over the course of 30 years, things start to nag at you, right? in this account, Frege combined two things. He observed which concepts had in fact turned out to be fruitful, and he suggested, quite plausibly as a working mathematician, that these were paradigms of extending knowledge, or that, let's say, they supported paradigms of extending knowledge. And then he gave a logical analysis of those concepts, which revealed that Frege's system could represent them, and Frege's rivals couldn't. Right? So I thought, okay, well, there it is. Shut her down. That question is solved. But the thing is, then it started to bug me. Fruitfulness doesn't mean just this delivers the goods. It seems to have overtones, and sometimes Frege seems to intend those overtones, of kind of creativity, of novelty, of discovery. It's that somehow there are times when he suggests that these concepts actually facilitate insight. Right? There's a point where he talks about the further hope of you discover these concepts which you can apply to more complicated cases. And I say, well, where does that come from? I mean, is that in there? Right? And certainly doesn't appear in the account I gave. Right? So it seems as if there's this kind of brute, unexplained, lucky accident. Here are the fruitful concepts. Here's my system which can represent them. Ta-da. Okay. So maybe Frege thought more than just that this was a lucky accident, but I didn't see what he could have meant. So that was nagging question number one. So I'll give a little bit more background, and then I'll return to some other nagging questions. Right? Because one thing about the Boole's calculating logic paper is that he also uses this phrase organic connection a lot in it. Right, here's one example. He's talking about the real difference between Boole and me is that I avoid such a division into two parts. The first dedicated to the relation of concepts, primary propositions. The second to the relation of judgments. And fabricate the whole with one mold. In Boole, the two parts run alongside one another, so that one is like the mirror image of the other, but for that reason stands in no organic connection to it. And then after unifying Boole's system within his own, he says, I believe that in a simple and appropriate way, I have set up an organic connection between Boole's two parts. And this phrase occurs a bunch of more times, but I don't want to just catalog them all right here. Now, the thing is that Frege doesn't just say that Boole's logic is not organic. He also emphasizes that it is mechanical. Right? And in this case, mechanical in the sense that a computer can do it. Right? So he says, Boole can then draw his inferences from the given assumptions by a mechanical process of computation. Stanley Jevons has in fact invented a machine to do this. Boolean formula language only represents part of our thinking. Our thinking as a whole can never be coped with by a machine or replaced by purely logical activity. Right. Now, this is actually kind of a bold claim, and there's a way in which it's actually rather prescient, because, as probably most of you know, restricting our attention to first-order validity, it is true that the decision procedure, there is no mechanical decision procedure for first-order validity, but Frege was surely not anticipating Church's theorem here. Right? He was a smart guy, but not that smart. Right? So you say, well, what's going on? What is it that gives him the confidence that his system is representing human thinking, not merely what can be done by a machine? And this is something which he continues to believe both early and late, that human thinking goes beyond what a machine can do, and his system captures some of those things. They say, okay, well, and there's another thing where I'm saying, where the heck does that come from? What reasons can he give for that? In what sense would Frege say my system is non-mechanical? Okay. Blah, blah. Oh yeah, and then the other thing was the interpretation I gave, which I still, as I say, feel is sort of entirely correct up to first approximation, after fine-tuning. That was based on an unpublished paper. It was a paper he tried to publish in some math journals, and then he got rejected. It was too philosophical, and then he tried to publish in a philosophy journal, and the editor said, you don't expect my readers to work through these symbols, do you? All right, so it never ended up meeting the journals. And I used that as a Rosetta Stone. Without actually having that unpublished paper there is no way I could have figured out what he was saying in section 98. But the trouble is, everybody around him, his readers, the readers he would have expected Grundlagen to have, they would not have that manuscript. How could Frege expect them to have any glimpse of what he was saying? Okay, so conjecture, right? Somehow or other, Frege was speaking in code. There were things that his audience, he could presume his audience would understand. There are ways that they would read his words. And now we just don't get it. We just don't see what he's alluding to. We don't see what's in the background, right? So I figured, okay, can I work out that shared background? All right. Then finally, and I'll just sort of skip over this quickly, what the heck is with that plants and seeds metaphor? Frege scholars have complained about it. I've got a quote from Dummett here. I won't go through it, but basically, nobody, neither I nor anybody else knew what the heck to make of that. Right, but it seems to be, he's saying it in a course of something where he really wants to talk to people. He wants to convey to them that Kant is mistaken. And so you're wondering, how is it supposed to do any work at all? Right, okay. And then finally, there's one other thing, and I'll kind of skip over this a little bit too, but it's, Frege says a lot about mechanical things, about mechanical computation, about what a machine can do. And it's very important to him to emphasize that arithmetic is not like that. Arithmetic is more, there's more to arithmetic than what a machine can do. And this sort of also shows up in a couple places in Grundlagen where he's talking about to other people like Kuno Fischer, right, where Kuno Fischer uses this phrase, aggregative mechanical thought, to suggest that computation and arithmetic is just basically glumping together, just piling things up, so to speak. And Frege, emphasizes that it's important. Not only is that wrong, but it's wrong in a deep and principled way. So how can we fit together these remarks about things being mechanical? Are they all scattered, or do they arise from some kind of unified point of view? Because he does talk about the mechanical a lot. Okay, so my objectives. Here's what I want to convince you of. That Frege's key metaphors would have been understood in very specific ways by the people close to him. Indeed, they might not have been viewed as metaphors. And Frege would be well aware of this. Right? I think because Frege himself was not really philosophically out and about. He was trained as a mathematician. He really had not done systematic study of philosophy. He would probably take for granted that the presuppositions of his environment were sort of the ways philosophers talk. Was philosopher talk. And to some extent, he'd be sort of right. This understanding included a recognized contrast with a lot of reverberations between organic and mechanical. The idea of the organic was seen as inherently linked to creativity, which establishes a background conceptual connection between this, quote, fruitfulness with overtones of creativity, not merely the sort of these happen in fact to be fruitful, as I suggested in 95, and organic structure. And then the background picture was salient enough that Frege could assume that he could, use it as a device for communication. It would be recognized even by people who didn't agree with the background theories that it was drawing on, because they would recognize what's being said. It's like if somebody today started talking about modal realism and to make a point, you might think, well, I can see the point they're trying to make even if I don't believe in modal realism myself, right? I get that. That's part of our code today. Okay, finally, appreciating this allows us to discern a systematic picture of the nature of mathematical thought behind Frege's remarks that might otherwise appear to be disconnected asides. And so finally, this leads us to the conclusion that to understand the, quote, father of analytic philosophy, unquote, we need to become familiar with the so-called continental style of philosophy to which Frege is thought to be diametrically opposed. Okay, so there's the project. I'm going to concentrate on Frege's local environment, although this is an environment that's sort of filtering, philosophical trends in German-speaking nations overall, right? And in specifically a figure by the name of Karl Snell, one of the few people Frege ever says nice things about. He was Frege's teacher. And before taking up Snell, though, There's another person that Frege knew very well, although this one he never says anything nice about, but it's very clear that he read him and he was familiar with him, and he learned philosophical language from him. It was a guy named Rudolf Eucken, right? And Eucken actually won a Nobel Prize, which seems impressive, but he also, if you ever look at these lists of worst Nobel Prizes in history, he's generally prominently featured. So, it's sort of good and bad. So this will give us a first foothold, right? Gives us a glimpse, right? Okay, so Eucken was a colleague, very close neighbor, and, I've got a reference here to Ivadata, who has sort of worked out in convincing detail that Frege and Eucken knew each other well enough that you could sort of say that he would have read Eucken's stuff. And in particular, there are two bits of writing in 1883. So this is just at the same time Frege is writing Grundlagen. Eucken wrote this essay on Kant's use of metaphors and similes. And there are a bunch of them, right? Kant uses a lot of metaphors, but in particular, Eucken picked a catalog, among the lots of metaphors, there were two that I want to focus on. A linked pair of building versus organic nature. And Eucken develops that as a linked contrast. Now, Eucken argues that Kant deploys the metaphor of a building often to describe conceptual and abstract structures, but that Kant views it as inadequate for circumstances in which there's an interconnection unifying a whole. The metaphor of a building presents the relation of the parts to the whole as constituted externally. The parts are pieced together to make up the whole, but they are independent of the whole, right? So you don't need reference to the whole to recognize the parts, right? You say, oh, that's a beam, right? You don't need to know what house it's in. Okay, Eucken adds that to do justice to cases where the whole and its parts are reciprocally interdependent, as for example with the parts of a living organism and the organism as a whole, Kant uses a different analogy. Right, says, and here this is quoting Eucken. Hence the inward about Kant. Hence the inward relationship of the structure requires a fresh expression, organic nature. All right, Eucken agrees that in Kant, organic nature. This could also be translated organic essence, or other option. This is used organic being. It's used to mark both inwardness and a purposeful association of parts. All right, so first benchmark. When Frege in '88 was making a point against Kant using the beams in the house plant and the seed contrast and the idea of organic connection, he was knowingly replying to Kant using Kant's own metaphors, right? Saying, look, Kant, you're talking about plants in the seed, plants in the seed, beams in the house. Well, look, I'm talking your language now. Mine is better. Okay. Another thing is, Eucken wrote a book in 1878. He reprinted it a lot, and he also said this a lot. Eucken was somebody who repeated himself a great deal. Right? And this was one of the things he's constantly saying. It was an elementary list of philosophical concepts. And it was not like particularly deep. It was more the sort of thing that, if a beginning philosophy undergraduate would take off the shelf to kind of learn what people mean by objective or something like that in philosophy books, and learn maybe a history of the concept, right? So it was really quite basic and meant to present, standard ways of talking. So there's a long list of them, and some of them are single concepts like experience, and then others are, linked contrasts like subjective, objective, realism, idealism. Mechanical and organic are paired in one entry as one of the recognized contrasts. This inclusion, so by including it in this relatively elementary book, this sort of suggests that the linked contrast of organic and mechanical was seen as a kind of standard assumption, right? It was a cliche. When you refer to something as organic, you can take it as maybe hinted at least that it's not mechanical. And a whole is organic in the relevant sense if the parts and the whole cannot be understood independently of one another. All parts are, and this is quoting, reciprocally purpose and means, and are connected in a way that's essential via internal structuring of the whole. Right. And as I say, Eucken says this a lot. Okay, now he also gives a kind of capsule thumbnail history of how this linked contrast became salient in 19th century philosophical context. And the part that is relevant to us is that first in Kant you get a principled sharp distinction between organic and mechanical. Right? In contrast, say, Leibniz thought that the organic was just extremely complicated mechanical stuff. It was a matter of difference of degree. Kant wanted to argue, no, it's a difference in kind. That distinction, again, Eucken repeats in this, that Kant expresses that distinction using the building materials organic nature metaphors. And this was part of a broader metaphysical and epistemological package in Kant that had among its consequences that biological reasoning could not be a science. Could not be a science in Kant's sense, since scientific knowledge of the world needs to be causal, that is, say, mechanical, right? And here we can just sort of borrow Kant's own words in the Critique of Judgment to express this. To be exact, therefore, organic matter is in no way analogous to any sort of causality that we know. It is therefore not capable of being explicated in terms analogous to any sort of physical capacities at our disposal. Okay, then, so you say, well, I mean, is that where it stops? No. The next step, a modified version of Kant's picture, which argued that you could extend knowledge in a scientific way using organic nature, appealed to the third critique, the Critique of Judgment, to argue that organic nature could be understood scientifically. This was propagated by Schelling and those of like mind within an overarching approach that you might translate as philosophy of nature, but normally in history it's referred to by its German title, Naturphilosophie. Right. Not just any old philosophy of nature, this specific one associated with Schelling and the gang, this sort of specific kind of idealist. So there are other things interesting in Schelling, in Eucken's discussion, but that'll do for now. That's enough Eucken. So anyway, just sort of say that this is, first of all, clearly Eucken is talking about things that he regards as standard assumptions. This is language that people use, and even people who don't believe the background theories recognize what you're saying when you say that. Okay. Now I want to consider Carl Snell. Now, the two professors, Carl Snell and Ernst Abbe, were Frege's most important teachers in his student years at Jena. They were central parts of Frege's environment when he returned to teach there. Right. Now, Abbe was, in fact, a scientific genius of the highest caliber, and it's very plausible to think that he influenced Frege in all sorts of ways as far as his technical abilities were concerned. I wrote a paper on this some years ago, and I won't repeat it. Snell, on the other hand, it's hard to see how he fits into the picture. Maybe he was supportive of Frege, maybe he was like a good guy, but it's hard to see exactly how he could have influenced Frege in any way, because, well, you'll see why. But Frege spoke incredibly highly of Snell. He says, my revered teacher, Carl C. Snell, put it this way. This was in sort of middle period writings. And he said, Carl Snell, a man long since dead, who was deeply revered by me at Jena, and then continues to say some more stuff. So who was this guy? He was the chair of physics and mathematics at Jena, right? And though, and there's, in some ways, he was not perfect for the job because he wasn't very good at physics and he wasn't very good at mathematics. In fact, he never published any research, research of value in those areas. But he did write a lot of philosophy. And he also wrote some widely used textbooks that presented a distinctive and somewhat influential approach to mathematics education. Right, so here I'm just going to look at some of his work as a philosopher. right? Okay, in his philosophical writings, Snell was generally characterized as being broadly influenced by Schelling and the Romantic author-philosopher Goethe. I'll concentrate on, Goethe will pop up every now and then incidentally, but I'll concentrate on Schelling. The most significant Schelling to Snell influence for present purposes is that Snell embraced Schelling's Naturphilosophie with its particular emphasis on the organic as fundamentally inexplicable in mechanical terms. Right. Snell also accepted a version of Schelling's identity philosophy, which is something, at least in Schelling's hands, seems to me absolutely bizarre, but in Snell's hands was much more moderate. And basically this idea that because there is an essential kind of structural identity between thought and reality, this is what allows thought to mirror organic reasoning. Now, this is a key component of Schelling's reply to Kant on the question of whether or not biological reasoning could deliver scientific extensions of knowledge. Right. I mean, Schelling's a complicated guy, and I can only give you sort of tip of the iceberg and mostly filter it through Snell. Okay, so the parts of the overall Schelling picture that I suggest informs Frege's remarks in 88 and elsewhere are mostly already present in Kant, particularly the critique of judgment, right? And they're already outlined in those outlines that Eucken gave. In particular, you find in Kant there's the emphasis on the profundity of the mechanical-organic distinction, a characterization the organic is bound up with the part-whole relation, parts of organic entities and the entity itself are reciprocally dependent, and a perceived connection I'll discuss soon between creativity and reasoning about organic nature. Right, okay. Now I want to quickly see how those ideas were filtered through Snell. This is how, Frege would have been exposed to them in part through this. So Snell came to people's attention as a philosopher with an 1830 monograph of philosophical observations in nature, which is Schelling Naturphilosophie in its pure form, right? And he gained a reputation, even among those not well disposed to Schelling, as unusually disciplined in his thinking for a Schellingite, right? And I have a bunch of reviews of this. I sort of saying, Snell, unusually disciplined for a Schellingite, but I'll skip them for time. But I do want to mention one review which said, wow, this guy is the best kind of Schellingite. He has all of the fantasy and speculation of Schelling and all the rigor of Hegel, right? So there you go, all the rigor of Hegel. That's what he said. Okay, one manifestation of Snell's view was a picture of ideas growing from a restricted set of basic concepts. And this is in the philosophical observations. The tracing back of the complicated and often mixed natural phenomena to simple fundamental phenomena, the explanation and derivation of a whole series of phenomena from a fact or assumption, is the final and highest goal of empirical science. Okay. Now, he regularly connects developing ideas from fundamental principles with the idea of potential and with developing out of a seed. And so this is from a book he wrote in 1858 called The Materialism Debate. He argues there that the organic is not reducible to the mechanical. And he writes of what he calls productive thinking as developing out of a few axioms as a simple germ, holding the potential of the entire tree of knowledge. And he presents this process of creatively developing thoughts out of a small set of axioms, let's say a germ, as analogous to the development of the potential of a biological organism. Okay, so I've got a quote here, I'll just go over quickly from Frege, where he seems to be echoing that language. This is from Frege's Begriffsschrift of 1879. Here Frege says, in this way we arrive at a small number of laws in which, if we add those contained to the rules, the content of all the laws is included, although in an undeveloped state, and that the deductive mode of presentation makes us acquainted with that kernel is another of its advantages, since in view of the boundless multitude of laws that can be enunciated, we cannot list them all. We cannot achieve completeness except by searching those that, by their power, contain all of them, right? And this is language that really resonates with Snell's language about these things, right? So it suggests that Frege was picking up some vocabulary from Snell at least. Okay, the materialism debate lays out Snell's view of the relations between mechanical and organic processes in considerable detail. This is a topic that Snell and others discussed informally as well, right? And I'll just sort of skip over this, but you can see it on the slide. There are some letters from a biologist who knew Snell and Abbe well, written a couple of years before Frege went to Jena, where he talks about, he's going on these long walks with Snell and Abbe, and they're talking about causality and biological organization, right? This was a theme that mattered, and they talked about a lot. Okay, they were also both identity philosophers, but I'll skip over that. Okay. Now, for time, I'm going to say, you'll just have to take my word for it, or read the paper when it comes out. Snell was one example of a bunch of people at Jena who were in one way or another immersed in this kind of romanticism, either Schelling or Goethe or both. And there was this sort of old, and there was a salon that Snell ran, which was extremely popular, very widely attended. Frege went to it, apparently a regular attendee. He was, he's remembered in various common, sort of retrospective reminiscences of it. This was dominated, as Abbe's biographer says, by Schelling and the Romantics. And Averbach also called Snell the last romantic among the mathematicians. Right. So I won't go into details about just who these people were. Just take my word for it. Although one of them was the inspiration for the character Ottilie in Goethe's Elective Affinities, but you can ask me about that in the question period. But got to move on. Okay. Let's go to the talk. I've mentioned a couple times the critique of judgment features in this story. So I noted above that there's a recognized dimension of Schelling's Naturphilosophie. That's that you go to Kant's critique of judgment and use it as a stepping stone to extending Kant's conception of potential scientific knowledge to include scientific knowledge of organic life. Right. In the critique of judgment, Kant's positive account of teleological thinking in biology drew from an antecedent analysis of purposiveness without purpose in aesthetic judgment. Reasoning about the organic was thereby linked to intellectual creativity. And this was a point that Schelling emphasized. Right. Oh, wait a minute. Sorry. There we are. Now, and rather than talk about Snelling, I'll talk about Snelling, that is to say Schelling as read by Snell. Just because that's more relevant to sort of how Frege was going to be getting this. In a work, which I should say is one of the best papers ever written on the philosophy of nocturnal animals, Snell makes the following remark that kind of sums up the position. It says, mechanical philosophy of the last century was confronted by Kant's critique of judgment, a work that's especially significant in its combination of two ideas, the idea of natural organism and the idea of products of fantasy or of artistic beauty. Thereby the productiveness of creative imagination and the creative nature of activity have been assigned a common idea sphere. The later German Naturphilosophie has recognized this work as the cornerstone of their speculations. Okay, now I'm going to skip some things about Snell as an educator. He was extremely influential and wrote extremely influential textbooks. The one thing I'll just sort of quickly mention is that his overall view, which was repeated a lot in the pedagogy journals, had this idea that the best way to structure geometry lessons for students was via something he called organic structuring, and he worked hard to explain how that was connected to what he called heuristic, which at that time was a term of art drawing from Schleiermacher, and where Schleiermacher said that the heuristic is what goes from familiar to new knowledge. Okay, and then there's one last thing, a quote in Snell's geometry textbook, and I just want to also just note some of the affinities with the language that Frege was using in section 88. So this is so Snell says through this proposition, there's actually an interesting proposition he's just proved, but won't go into the details of it, but there's actually a lot more in the background here. He says, these propositions put forward above on the relation of sides and angles in the triangle become fruitful and capable of leading us to new conclusions in a way that allows us to arrive at conclusions which were not directly contained in the assumptions. And he adds that thinking and the formation of knowledge through thinking consists only in drawing conclusions from propositions. Right? So here, his sort of background sense of how thinking works is, at least in the sciences, echoes Frege. Okay. Now we've got a bunch of information. Let's go back to section 88. See what's going on. Right? So we start a few sentences. They're pretty uncontroversial. Kant seems to think of concepts as defined by a simple list of characteristics in no particular order. All the ways of forming concepts, this is one of the least fruitful. Look through the definitions, none of them are like that. In this book, none of them are like that. Same is true of the fruitful definitions in mathematics, like continuity. Right? So far, so good, right? That part wasn't problematic before. Then we get to, we do not have here a series of conjunctions of marks, like, a list of properties. But I would, a more intimate, I would say more organic connection of defining elements, right? So that sort of will suggest a bunch of things. First of all, there's a tacit contrast with the mechanical. There's this some idea that the whole and part are reciprocally interdependent, and so forth, right? This, using that phrase in this sort of a context brings with it a bunch of other reverberations. So then we, blah, blah, blah. Okay, skip that. Okay, so by linking fruitfulness to organic connections, this would be understood in this context to signify a cluster of theoretical virtues, including a connection between creativity and extending knowledge, law-governed development and rational system, and a kind of a distinctive epistemological and metaphysical status turning on the interdependence of part and whole. And also, I forgot to mention, and there's an implicit contrast with the mechanical. All right. Okay, so Frege continues. With these lists of characteristics definitions, nothing essentially new emerges in the process. But the more fruitful type of concept determination draws boundary lines that were not previously given at all. What we shall be able to infer from it cannot be inspected in advance. Here we are not simply taking out of the box again what we have just put into it. Right? And here you sort of have this picture of, Boole will string together these, what we now call Boolean combinations of properties. And basically they, like in a Venn diagram, an Euler diagram, in the Boole's calculating logic paper, Frege even draws such diagrams. All of the boundary lines are already there. But on the other hand, when you're given a content and there's a question about how to decompose it and how to reconstitute it, those boundaries are not given in advance. They require additional intellectual work. These consequences extend our knowledge and are therefore, on Kant's view, to be regarded as synthetic. Yet they can be proven purely logically and are thus analytic. And now we finally get to the metaphor. They are, in fact, contained in the definitions, but like a plant in a seed, not like a beam in the house, right? So they say, look, Kant, you've told us about this, you've made a certain kind of distinction between organic and mechanical, you've used these specific metaphors. I am telling you that what I am presenting is more like the organic and unlike the mechanical. Okay, let's see. Okay, so Frege reinforces the connection of fruitfulness to novel discovery, to creative thought. Just sort of skip. And Frege could expect that the final plant seed remark would have been recognized as reasserting, using the metaphors Kant himself uses in such connections, the thesis about the structure of the fruitful concepts to convey why the fruitful concepts could do what Kant himself thought they couldn't. Kant's concepts could be dealt with by mechanical means. Truly fruitful concepts are different in kind. Frege is drawing on a very known picture of organic nature in Naturphilosophy that marshals the third critique as a means to go beyond the limits marked out for mechanical reasoning in the first critique. That story links fruitful concepts as Frege describes them with creative discovery, with novelty. Okay, so summing up. The moral. In using the phrase organic connection, the relatives, invoking a contrast between plant seeds and Beam's house, Frege was speaking in a code that he would have expected reasonably his readers to recognize. It's a code we have now lost, right, except perhaps in the Schelling scholar community. He was invoking a background web of concepts that were well known, were especially prominent among the colleagues, teachers, and friends close to him. This makes it less mysterious why Frege didn't feel the need in Grundlagen to expand beyond the terse remarks of '88. He could confidently expect that his readers would grasp what he was claiming and appreciate how it fit with his theory overall. Thanks for your attention.